Hello everyone, and this is Shady Oak doing a newly discovered impression of Alex Jones. I don't know the brother personally. Eschatology is pretty weird, but he is a brother in the Lord, and I love the guy. So I'm going to be going through the book of Nahum, verse by verse, and figured that we could all learn something and be entertained at the same time. This may be amusing, and I hope to watch some of his vernacular being put on display here today. But understand that besides the voice and the presentation, this is fully serious, and I intend to, through sound exegesis, lay out the book for you so you can study it on your own time. Now, for the sake of time, and due to the fact that I am in fact related to Scott Richards, I will only be going through one verse here today, but this verse will be an introduction to the book as a whole, and with future recommendations, perhaps we can go through more in the future. Nahum chapter 1 and verse 1 begins with the advertisement of why we call it the book of Nahum to begin with. The burden against Nineveh, the book of the vision of Nahum the Elkoshite. Now, the historical background of the book of Nahum is given in the internal data as well in the account itself and external data that we can verify the information given within throughout history. The information that it leaves out, of course, will also be relevant, but understanding who, when, and why this was written are all given in this first verse. Who is Nahum? Well, Nahum is an abbreviation of the name Nehemiah. Nehemiah, however, is not to be confused with the other book of Nehemiah, and we don't want two Nehemiahs at two entirely different points of history. So he did us the favor of condensing his name to understand a distinction between himself and the Nehemiah who would represent the Medo-Persian Empire when the Babylonian exile and the fulfillment of Daniel, and Jeremiah's prophecies were finished. He is also described as an Elkoshite. Now, an Elkoshite, we don't know where this would have been in ancient Israel because, spoiler alert, it is dated to around the 7th, 6th century BC. Now, I'll provide evidence for what would have been in ancient Israel, since, given the association of the tradition, this city that we would associate with him by tradition was called Capernaum, which was also named after him as literally the city of Nahum. We don't have confirmation in the text, so I will leave it in the realm of speculation, but understand that this significant city, even in the ministry of Jesus of Nazareth, is something that we all need to take into account. We know for certain, however, that this prophet was speaking words of comfort to God's people, as well as a warning to the nation of Assyria, because, as Nehemiah's name is, Yahweh our comfort, or comfort of Yahweh, the significance of this is not easy to miss. Now, moving on from the who to the when. Before the destruction of the Assyrian Empire. Now that we can be sure of for certain. You don't warn someone who no longer exists. In fact, it was predicting the reason why this was about to take place. As the prophets of the Old Testament repeatedly identified Babylon as a power that God would use to judge the nations, what we're about to read is that Assyria, the 800-pound military and economic gorilla at the time, was first on the hit list. Now, Assyria's destruction, according to the Babylonian Chronicle, took place around 612 BC. Nahum, in going to mentioning chapter 3 and verse 8, their victory, Assyria's victory over Thebes, that their city was destroyed around 50 years before the end of their empire. And Nahum correctly refers to it by the name it would have been known by at this time, No Ammon. These are just some of the historical details I could give you to verify that this prophecy wasn't written after the fact. First, it addresses events that haven't happened within the time frame it's being spoken of, acknowledged events accurately and contemporarily with what he's describing. There are no anachronisms, no errors, no nonsense. There's information we don't know, but the information we need to know is given. Now, the why of Nahum is also important because Nineveh had been told by God once before and been spoken to him directly regarding the moral accountability they would take for their actions. And in spite of the fact that their ancestors, a mere 150 years before this, one generation removed from the ministry of Jonah, they responded to him. They listened to his preaching. That's how close together these prophecies are. Their children were going back to the customs and the habits that are described briefly, albeit graphically, by the Greek historian Herodotus, by some of the most brutal and barbaric people that you could imagine. I don't mean that they couldn't speak Greek. I mean, these people were nuts. There's accounts that are outside of the Bible, Herodotus is one of them, of entire cities committing mass suicide at the mere rumor that the Assyrians were going to come against them in battle. They'd use what was called winnowing tactics, purposefully targeting civilians and non-combatants to gather prisoners, so they then brutalized them and psychologically used them as weapons against the militaries that they were coming up against. The women in particular were very extreme. They used expert torture techniques in skinning people alive outside of enemy walls right before their armies would attack, so that the screams of their victims would be fresh in the minds of the city's defenders and thus be less motivated to fight back, knowing that they would have their turn later. They'd make pyramids of the heads of the celebrities in the city, and not just the celebrities like, the big names and stuff, like the people that the city actually liked. And they'd put them in a public square as a warning of what rebellion would bring as a result of them taking over the city. Then they'd take the captives, the locals of the city, the patriots, and they'd put hooks in the noses of the captives and drag them by chariots to new locations so they couldn't reorganize under their united national identities. We see examples of this in and outside of Scripture as well, not just in hieroglyphics, but in the biblical accounts. The wicked king of Israel, Manasseh, was subject to this treatment in the book of 2 Kings. What's also interesting is that, if we're just going to put it in a word, these people were animals. They were demonic, and the worst part is that they knew better, and that's the point. When we read Jonah calling them out for the way that they treated people, they didn't know better and asked the true and living God for mercy. And get this, they got it. The next generation was judged in light of what they knew as well as the globalist elites, the anti-theists. All these people have been exposed to the gospel and disregarded it. That is what they were doing. They were being held accountable, and that is how God judges. The prime targets through their fallen sinful natures to model the enemy's heart so perfectly is what made them this way. Now, am I saying they're possessed? Not necessarily. But when I'm making the point that they model the heart of a murderer and a liar and a destroyer, that is the point. You don't even need direct examples. You have to believe in the supernatural to see this being demonstrated in history. For example, in the time of the New Testament, Emperor Nero was a good example of this, until the time that he encountered the Apostle Paul when appealing his unjust arrest before Caesar. We don't know anything about that today. As the right was for every Roman citizen, he was just as competent a ruler as anyone else would have been. It was only after Paul shared the gospel with him and he rejected it that he went literally insane. He began persecuting Christians as a scapegoat for his wanton crimes and corruption that even pagans like Tacitus, who had no love for Christians, by the way, saw as a point that they were going to not only just consider this as a distraction, but also noting that there's no love for the Christians. Even he had sympathy for the way they were treating him. There are accounts of him going to this basement filled with bugs and just stabbing them as a way to, I guess, spend your time. There's, speculative accounts, but notes that his mother's last words when he ordered her death was to strike her womb first, because this bore Nero. And what's interesting about this as well is that when we're talking about the decline, it is not a coincidence that after hearing the gospel, that total separation from his opportunity to have a relationship with the true and living God, that in exchange for the truth, he chose a lie and modeled the heart of the liar. What's also interesting about this as well is that when we use the word sin, we're just talking about missing the mark. What Nahum's audience was doing was what we'd call transgressing. They were sinning with a high hand. They were not only doing it in the face of the true and living God, but they knew better. People who haven't had a personal revelation of God will only be given an account of what they knew. But these people knew God, and they were going to be held accountable. They simply didn't care. And that is where the line is crossed for God concerning mercy. It isn't that they don't have information, it's that they just don't care. Now, he has waited centuries and played no favorites, even concerning his own people. Read the book of Daniel, noting their time in Babylon wasn't an easy one. But this should sober us all as a nation that has had more access to the gospel than any other. Assyria, for example, they weren't under a covenant with God like Israel was, but they were exposed to the gospel. The United States, despite the attempts of false teachers and bad just I'm the last person to speak about, sensationalizing and stuff. Look who I'm impersonating. But when we're talking about the idea of a nation that is under direct terms and conditions agreement with God, we are simply citizens in this country, that the Christian presence in this country has made it a conduit of mercy. But not just that. We're also told in the book of Genesis chapter 12 that a promise to Abraham is what would make the United States uniquely a vessel and target of mercy rather than judgment, like the nation of Assyria, like the capital of Nineveh that was the crown of their empire. And by the way, it was noted it was destroyed so totally that until we were able to uncover the ruins, there wasn't much left. They thought that this was a mythological city. The anti-theists, the globalists, they tried to cover this up. We exposed it. We showed it was a lie. They actually had a city named Nineveh, and it was destroyed at the time that we would recognize it. It's also worth noting that archaeologically, the city of Thebes was destroyed 50 years prior to Nineveh's destruction, and that fits the historical data as well. But when we're talking about these things and looking at the data, we need to consider this piece of information. Abraham's promised him and those who would carry on this covenant, this messianic line, they were going to be a blessing to the whole world. Then God told Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, look it up, it says, I will bless those who bless you, I will curse those who curse you. Now, I don't want to be cursed by God. I want to be a blessing to God. And so if we want to be a vessel of this blessing, we need to encourage our legislators to not only continue to support God's people in an alliance politically, but also in a personal relationship individually to the Hebrew people. We need to be a blessing to them if we want to be a vessel of mercy like we have been. So understand that we need to keep this as positive or there will literally be hell to pay. Now, when we're talking about all this, and I can go on, believe me, we have a lot of data here in regards to not only the language that Nehemiah uses, the references that he uses, the historical information that he uses, but for the time being, I just wanted to give you the who, the when, and the why. The who was Nehemiah, shorthand for, of course, Nahum, and when he was presenting this information to Nineveh, the capital of Assyria, it was to an audience that knew better. That was the why. And the when, of course, would be said around the 7th century BC, and we have archaeological evidence to back that up. God's word is true. Let every man be a liar. So I want to thank you all. Again, for the sake of time, I'll stop there. If you were blessed by this and want to go through the 3 chapters of the book like this, as Alex Jones, let me know, and I'll do my best to all things together. But in the meantime, I want to thank you for yours and remind you that God has not only been merciful, but he's also no fool. Receive Jesus Christ and the offer of mercy for what you've done against him, or you will stand before a holy God with only your righteousness to support you, which is 0. God bless. Now, this is how God judges. This is... the globalist elites, Now the 800 pound, let me do that again.